So this is just a quick presentation on Building for Life, and to give you an overview of what it's all about, a little bit about the background to the initiative, the policy context, just to explain that Building for Life is a partnership and who the partners are, and then some quick examples of schemes that we've come across, design features that we've come across which we think are particularly successful or unsuccessful perhaps. And then also a little bit about how it's being used at the moment, and especially how it's going to be used in the future. And I could imagine that that's where we'll get into some quite interesting discussions. Now, fundamentally, why do we think this is important? We think it's important because the homes and neighbourhoods that we build are really our legacy for the future. They're our legacy for generations to come. And we really should be creating places where people will want to live long into the future. That's right at the heart of current thinking about sustainable communities, is to try and create places which will be attractive places of choice. Now, lovely words, but the image here is perhaps not quite so encouraging. This is a scheme that we came across as part of our housing audit, about which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. It's taken on a rainy day, which is unflattering, but at the same time, I think you'll agree that as a place to live, this offers very little. The outdoor space is entirely dominated by car parking. The landscaping is unsympathetic, there's poor lighting, the architecture of the buildings is, well, very plain, let's say. You've got huge blank gables there, and actually, I took this photograph, and with that building on the left-hand side, if you live on the ground floor of that building, you have a space exactly the same as this on the other side of it as well. So it's really not very appealing. We've got to do better than this, surely, if we're going to be creating places that leave a proud legacy for the future. Now, about 5 years ago, CABE set out on a housing audit to, I suppose, gain an understanding of the quality of residential neighbourhoods being built around the country. We used the Building for Life criteria as a basis for the housing audit, and over the course of 3 years between 2005 and 2007, we went around England on a region-by-region basis. We divided it into sort of 3 chunks of work. Each year we looked at 100 schemes by the 10 most prolific house builders in those regions. We really looked at mid-market mainstream housing. So we were really looking at the kind of homes that would be available to your average home buyer. Generally they were in schemes of more than 20 dwellings, and they would have been completed within the last 3 years of the audit. So it is important to remember that the oldest schemes might have been completed around 2001, which does mean that they would have been processed through the planning system under quite a different policy framework. So things have changed over that time. Very importantly, we also spoke to residents about how they felt about where they lived. It was important to us because we wanted to ensure that we get that reality check. So our experts who went out to assess the schemes using the criteria obviously came up with their view, but it was very important to understand how the residents who lived there felt about where they lived. That was a really interesting piece of work. Some of the comments that residents came up with were quite challenging, but overall there was, I think, a sense of agreement, even if maybe the language used was a little bit different. And it is important also to remember that this was essentially a self-selecting sample, so the people who lived there had already made the choice to live in these neighbourhoods. The picture which came out of this housing audit was rather sobering. So we had about 18% of schemes which achieved more than 14 out of the 20 Building for Life criteria, which is not very much, or not very many, I should say. And then there were nearly 30% of the schemes which achieved fewer than 10 out of the 20 criteria, which is quite alarming, really, especially when you think that that first image I showed you of that very rainy car park, that's a scheme in that poor bracket. So essentially what this is telling you is that nearly 30% of our schemes are, broadly speaking, of that kind of standard. And that was quite an alarming finding. But let's try and keep this positive. There were also great examples. This is a scheme which we thought was so good we actually decided to identify it as an example of best practice through giving it a Building for Life award. This is actually in Warrington. And the point here is really not so much whether you like the slightly Lord of the Rings architecture. The point here is that there's this great green space at the heart of the development. So it's a very high quality piece of outdoor environment for everybody who lives there to share. All the buildings are grouped around it, so it lends a very strong sense of place to this scheme. The other reason why this is very clever is that actually behind those taller buildings there in the background is the M62 motorway, and yet I've been in this space, and when you're there, you don't have any sense of this quite major transport infrastructure. It's very cleverly shields the scheme from the noise of traffic, so it's quite cleverly laid out. It's an example of good urban design making the best out of what could be perceived as a very challenging site. So what do we mean when we talk about good design? Well, we always take it back to these three principles here, which we didn't invent. They've been around for a very long time. They were originally written down by Vitruvius, the Roman scholar. As a consequence, the terms vary sometimes because they're obviously all translated from the Latin, but we do believe that good design can only be achieved by achieving a lucky balance between these three objectives. Functionality, so whether the design is fit for purpose, firmness or durability, whether it's going to last essentially, and also what it looks like. It is important that it raises our spirits. So you can apply this at any scale, so whether it's to do with the layout of your kitchen or the layout of the rooms in your home or the layout of the space outside your front door, or in fact the whole street layout of the neighbourhood. Whether it works, whether it's easy to find your way around is really important. The durability is important as well, and that's not only in terms of the materials and the detailing, but it's also in terms of the sort of wider sustainability of the scheme. Will it be feasible to keep yourself warm and heat the home that you live in years to come? That might be a really crucial point. And then, of course, finally, it should also look nice. You should feel good about where you live. Now, there's quite a strong policy background to all of this, and I've just flashed up here some of the most important documents. Obviously, most important to Building for Life and housing more generally is Planning Policy Statement 3, and I've grouped that together there with the Code for Sustainable Homes, but also other documents, such as the Manual for Streets, which introduced major innovation in the world of highways design about a year ago. And then there's also the Planning Policy Statement 1. Planning Policy Statement 1 includes an aspiration that all new developments, or a requirement that all new developments should make a positive contribution to the quality of life in the wider area. That might sound like a very bland and generic statement, but it is really important to just step back for a moment and think, if this development is not making a positive contribution, if it's not making this place better, why would we actually go for it? It's a really important thing to hold on to. Just to say that obviously we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and so the idea behind Building for Life is always that it should work as a kind of umbrella, and actually a lot of the existing standards, a lot of the existing policy guidance sits under there, and that it's really a way to pick up on existing policy that you might have nationally or you might have in your local authority. So we really don't want to invent any of these things, and I'll point out the linkages as we go through the criteria. It is a partnership which stands behind Building for Life. It's led by CABE in combination with the Home Builders Federation, so it's very important there to understand that it does have buy-in from the industry body. And it's also been supported by the Housing Corporation and English Partnerships in the past. Obviously, the merger into the new Homes and Communities Agency adds a whole new dimension to that, so that's quite an exciting time for us. I'll just move on to the criteria briefly here. They are grouped into 4 chapters, the first being about the environment and community. This is really harking back to that Planning Policy Statement 1 thought about what does this scheme do for quality of life in the wider area. The next chapter is about the character and sense of place, trying to create places which have a strong sense of identity and which can really foster a strong sense of community long into the future. Then there's a heading here about streets, parking and pedestrianisation, Manual for Streets obviously being a really important point of reference there. And then finally there's a chapter on the design and construction of the actual buildings. Things like modern methods of construction come to bear in that chapter. Just to quickly point out that these points do link to the kind of information that we would recommend should be included in an exemplary design and access statement. So we have brought along a few copies of this guidance which we produced on reading and writing design and access statements, and you'll find some of those on your desk. And later on in the day we'll also be able to show you a design and access statement which is very concise but which was phrased in terms of the Building for Life criteria. So actually if you're trying to assess the potential of a particular design proposal to perform well against the criteria, the design and access statement might be your first port of call, and you could actually encourage developers and their design teams to phrase their information about the scheme in terms of the criteria. So just quickly show you the headings. On your desk you have the little ring-bound flip chart, and there's more copies available of that if you don't succeed in taking one home with you today. Just contact us via the website and we can send you another one of those at any time. So here are the 5 criteria about the scheme's performance in terms of the environment and community. I won't read them all out to you because there is a little bit more detail and we'll be talking about them a little bit more later on during the day. These are the 5 criteria which are about the character of the scheme. And just to say, this scheme here, which we've used to illustrate this point, is actually a development up in Durham. It's another scheme which we gave a Building for Life award because we think it performs very well against the criteria. As you can see, it's extremely traditional looking, so you'd hardly believe that this is only about 3 years old. Now, Durham is a very historical city, obviously has a tremendously rich built heritage, and so it was felt that in that context this was quite an appropriate response. In a different setting, you might take a very different approach. So there are examples from new towns like Harlow, for example, where the design and the architecture of the buildings is much more adventurous, and that might be very appropriate in that setting. So just to say, all of these questions are open questions. They're not necessarily prescriptive in expecting a particular type of response, but they are all itemised an issue which is really important for the overall success of the scheme. This is the chapter on streets, parking and pedestrianisation, so you can see many points here about balancing the requirements of pedestrians, cyclists and car users, trying to accommodate car parking, and just achieving a lucky balance between what is really the most heavily used space in any development, the space outside your front door, essentially the public realm by a slightly more mundane title here. Safety, of course, also tremendously important, so there are linkages here to guidance like the Safer Places guidance produced by the Home Office, or the Secure by Design tool, which is promoted by the Association of Chief Police Officers. And finally here the chapter on design and construction, so things like the actual design and management arrangements for the public space, the actual architectural quality of the buildings themselves. Now, there are obviously things like materials and detailing will be important, but in many cases you might have local design policies. I gather that some boroughs, for example, have policy on balconies or on space standards, so this is really an opportunity for you to look at the fitness for purpose of the actual homes being provided. Also looking at the ability to adapt, convert or extend the homes for changing requirements, and things like the lifetime home standard is quite important here. So whether you've actually got homes which are built in a way that if your requirements change, you don't have to move. You can move, but you don't have to, is really important. Modern methods of construction, and then also an opportunity to recognise schemes which do more than the statutory minimum which might be recommended. Now, we just wanted to show you a few examples of some of the schemes that we came across when we were doing our housing audit work. So in a sort of compare and contrast fashion, on the left-hand side here, you see a scheme where actually all the buildings are very similar, and if you imagine coming home late of an evening, ask yourself whether you would be able to find your own house. They all look very much the same. But aside from that, there's a more serious point here, which is that if you look at the outdoor space between the buildings, it's not very well designed. So this photograph is taken during the day, and there's only one car parked up there, but you might expect that of an evening as people come home from work, there will be many more cars there, and it'll actually be quite congested. Also, the pavements are quite narrow, so even now, if you had a buggy or some shopping, or perhaps you were in a wheelchair, you would find it quite difficult to get past that parked car. So it's not really very well thought through. There isn't a particularly successful balance between the different users of this space. And also the lighting isn't that great. Obviously it'll benefit from light streaming out from the windows, but there's not much street lighting. So overall, it's a rather bland and characterless space, but it's also not very fit for purpose. So there's a whole range of criteria there which you could apply to that space, and where I think you might find it wanting. The example on the right-hand side is another scheme which happens to be in Reading, It's called Manor Farm. We just show this here because we think it strikes a more lucky balance between the different users who might use this space. So you've got pedestrians, you've got vehicles, but then also you have some green space and some slightly more sympathetic landscaping as well. And here's another example about highway design. So on the left-hand side, you have an image of a neighbourhood which is essentially a sort of small-scale residential neighbourhood where you would expect neighbours to crisscross the street, you would expect children to be riding their bikes, and you would expect motorists to drive with due care to ensure that it's a safe pedestrian environment. So you would expect motorists to drive at low speed and to be paying attention to what's going on around them. But actually, what you have here is a design which is much more appropriate for a sort of motorway environment. So you've got this roundabout, you've got the arrows just to make sure you go around the roundabout. That's not the right way. You've got lane dividers, you've got sleeping policemen, a whole sort of range of highways design features which are, strictly speaking, not really necessary in this environment. It sends out very mixed messages, and in fact you can also see that in that road just where the car is parked. There's a speed bump there to try and sort of slow people down again. So it's very confused actually in terms of what the sort of message to motorists is there. Now the image on the right hand side is actually in Taunton. It's quite a heavily used roundabout in the centre of Taunton. It probably takes a multiple in terms of sheer traffic volume. And yet if you look at the design of this roundabout, it's much more low-key, much less visual clutter, so you don't have any of those kind of arrows or kind of lots of white street markings are kept to a minimum. It's got good clear sight lines, but it also uses other things like the actual surfacing of the highway, because they've used these cobbles which obviously look very appealing in a historical setting. They're also quite loud. So as a pedestrian, you can hear cars approaching. As a motorist, it's quite noisy if you're driving faster. So it does combine different ways of making that slow down a little bit. And it feels quite safe to cross this street, even though there isn't a formal crossing. And I think that's quite a successful example of how you can resolve those different user requirements there. Well, I think don't really need to say too much about the space on the left-hand side, but it's a car parking space. There are only 6 cars there, but they're already all sort of cluttering each other up, so it's not particularly rationally laid out. It's badly lit. There's virtually no overlook at all, and it's deeply unappealing. The image on the right-hand side is from Waterston Park, a scheme down in Greenhithe, and you've got many of the same features. You've got car parking, you've got a pedestrian space, but it's also a space which could be used much more successfully, perhaps by children riding their bikes. It's actually a little cul-de-sac space, so there's no through traffic. The landscaping is much more sympathetic. The use of materials is more appealing. It's well lit. It's well overlooked. So it succeeds in many ways in which the space on the left-hand side doesn't. And just to bring it down to your sort of front door and your daily experience of coming home of an evening, if you look at the image on the left-hand side, what you have there is a slightly strange mixture of materials, which perhaps are reflecting just what the builder had left over in their yard, and also a not particularly successful layout and arrangement. So if you park your car on the left-hand side and open your driver's side door, you immediately step into a flower bed, which is sort of, it's nice to have planting, but maybe not just right there. Also, because the planting doesn't have any edge to it, you'll find all that mud which gets washed out, on a rainy day, being trampled into your hallway, so it's not great. And then also, if you imagine 2 cars parked up here and you're coming out with your buggy perhaps, or with your buggy, or you're coming home with your shopping, it would be quite difficult to actually squeeze between. So it's not a particularly successful layout. The balance between pedestrian and vehicle space is not very well achieved. The example on the right-hand side, again, this is in Waterston Park, obviously a larger house, but at the same time you've got the front door, you've got a car parking space, you've got the pavement and the road, and you've got a sort of defensible space in front of the building just to create a little bit of a buffer to the public realm. Is much more successfully laid out. Very simple, but just works much better than the example on the left-hand side. Another example here, just to talk about the architectural quality of the actual buildings themselves. We're not we're not snobbish about this, but if you look at the building on the left-hand side, very confused approach there. Probably, perhaps the result of design by committee. You've got lots of different things going on. You've got a sort of lean-to bit, which is probably something to do with the overall roof height. You've got sort of bay windows, which don't really quite fit the bulk of the building. You've got a little archway in the roof line, which is sort of trying to lend that a certain something, but perhaps not terribly successfully. And then in the middle of it, you've got this huge archway, which leads through to actually nothing very much behind it. So it's not a very successful mix. But more importantly, apart from being perhaps visually unappealing, it's also not particularly functional. So if you imagine as a pedestrian trying to get through to the area behind, the expectation is that you would walk through those little archways on either side of the roadway there, and yet the space is very narrow and the ceiling is very low, it's very badly lit. If somebody were coming the other way, there's not actually enough space for you to pass by each other. So personally, I would probably take my life in my hands and walk through the roadway, but that might not be everybody's choice, but I don't think it's a particularly successful balance between these different features. So taking it back to that Vitruvius triangle about fitness for purpose, visual appeal and durability, I think it fails at least on 2 of those counts. So how do we get there? Well, over the years we've been collating examples of schemes which we think do particularly well against the Building for Life standard, and I've just grouped together 3 here. We've got about 60 case studies up on our website at the moment, so they're drawn from a whole range of different settings and situations, and I've tried to reflect that range here with these 3. So on the left-hand side you have a scheme right in the heart of Stockport. It's a very small-scale scheme. There's only 12 units in this particular development. As you can see, it's dealing with historical buildings in a historical context. So it's small-scale, historical, infill, right in the centre of town. It's led by a housing association. Then you have in the middle a major estate renewal scheme in Lewisham, in Deptford, the Pepys estate, which you can see is a much larger scale type of scheme. It's also housing association led, and a major regeneration scheme, and also you can see the architecture is of quite a different sort of style. And then on the right hand side you have a market rate scheme by a very small developer in Somerset with very high environmental aspirations. So homes perform to very high environmental standards, and the materials have been sourced very carefully, as you can see it's in a sort of rural setting, so very different schemes. Just to say, these are open questions and they can be applied to a whole range of different schemes in different contexts. Just to show you very quickly some examples of last year's Building for Life award winners. So this is actually a later stage of that scheme in Stockport that I was showing you earlier on. In the courtyard there's actually space for a little bit of infill there, so you do have a mixture of new and old. And then this is a scheme in Hackney, which some of you may know, called Adelaide Wharf. A particularly successful example built on part of English Partnership's London-wide initiative, using a lot of modern methods of construction there, both in the terms of the facade cladding and the balconies and the overall construction of the scheme. Then this is a scheme in Brighton, near the railway station, sorry, gone a bit too fast there, with a very nicely landscaped courtyard there, and that's a mixture of social and market rate housing. This is a very large-scale regeneration scheme in the town centre of Portsmouth, multi-use, so it includes commercial and retail uses as well as residential uses, and a very high-quality public realm as well. Here's, Woolwich Arsenal, again a major regeneration scheme in Woolwich, using a lot of historical buildings and also creating a very high-quality outdoor environment. And this is a scheme in Sheffield where the owners of the shop at the ground floor actually redeveloped this scheme, so a small-scale developer but in quite a prominent location, a sort of landmark building at the local scale. Now, Building for Life was initially conceived as a way of looking at completed schemes, but in fact over the years we've found it increasingly useful as a way of looking at schemes during the design, development and planning stages. So here you have a sort of I suppose, a kind of overall timeline for a given scheme, and there's different points at which Building for Life might engage. So it might engage at the brief development stage, it might apply at the pre-application discussion stage, and that's what many of you, if you're working in local authorities, might be doing with it. Then obviously English Partnerships Housing Corporation and now the Homes and Communities Agency have a requirement that schemes should meet the Building for Life standard. There's a link into design review, for example. There's also the standards and awards, which are sort of published annually as a way of celebrating best practice. It's used in housing audits, and most recently also as a requirement for Building for Life assessments to be included in annual monitoring returns. Just to sum up very briefly, commitments from other partners. So English Partnerships requires that all developments on their land should fulfil at least 14 out of these 20 criteria, and the Housing Corporation in the past has required that at least 12 out of the 20 criteria should be met, but they do make an allowance there for schemes which are sort of smaller or are in a rural setting, just recognising that it's going to be difficult to achieve some of those criteria there. The Department for Communities and Local Government has set quite ambitious standards for performance in the Thames Gateway, and we're working with a lot of the local authorities and delivery vehicles there to help them work towards that aim. And then also there's many local authorities around the country considering putting Building for Life in their core strategies and their local development frameworks, in supplementary planning documents, and then also using it in planning discussions. I'm sure we'll be talking more about that later on today. And then finally also in annual monitoring returns. Now we've been developing quite a lot of guidance, and this is available on our Building for Life website. So you have a PDF document there which runs you through all of the criteria in a little bit more detail. And really this is something which we thought would be useful, particularly also for design teams, for developers, just to explain to them that if you're looking at a scheme on paper, then the kind of information that you might need as evidence could be set out in some generally quite simple diagrams. So this allows you to navigate around the different criteria and just sort of get an idea of the kind of documents that might be presented to help you understand how a scheme performs. We do have here today also for you to look at later a design and access statement which includes very good examples of different drawings and visualizations which help you understand how that scheme performs against the criteria. In terms of the accredited assessors, the objective of today, just to sum up that very briefly, we have a big program to train and support at least one accredited assessor in each local planning authority in England. So overall that'll be around 360 over the course of 3 years, so it's quite an ambitious program. And we're also training independent assessors who work outside the local authority but can support perhaps planning officers or development control officers who might be using the tool in looking at pre-application settings. At the pre-application stage, we're envisaging that you might be using the Building for Life tool to look at schemes as they come across your desk, that you might produce a Building for Life score for those assessments. That might feed into the deliberations of, say, local planning committees. And also it will feed in to, once the schemes have been completed, it will also feed into the annual monitoring returns being collated for those developments. Generally, as an assessor, you would produce a score, but very importantly, you would also produce an evaluation report, and there's a sort of standard template from that which you can also download from our website. And in many ways it's actually equally important, your reasoning is equally important as the actual score that you arrive at in the end, because it's very important that you're quite transparent about how you arrived at that particular conclusion. This report might be referred to, as I said before, officers or the planning committee, or it might be referred to by funders or landowners who have made a commitment to achieving a certain standard against these criteria. It might also be referred to by the judges if you submit a scheme for the Building for Life Awards. So we will also be continuing to look for best practice examples to celebrate with an award, and those assessments will be very useful. And hopefully in the long term there'll be a way of tying that in successfully with the collation of annual monitoring reports. And this is just a little bit about the homework. I'll give you advance warning of this. So if you would like to become an accredited assessor, what we would like you to do is to go to the website. There's all the information you need is presented there. There is an example scheme which we would like you to download and then produce an assessment of that scheme to return to us for our review, and we'll get back to you on that with our comments as soon as you send it back. So that gives you an idea of what our expectation is from you.